Okay guys, let's say you were successful on your hunt, and maybe that was because of some of the information that we shared in those firearm considerations. Now we're going to talk about game processing, both in the field and at home. What to do first when game is down? You're going to want to approach the animal very cautiously with a loaded firearm and ensure that it has expired. This is a great opportunity to have gratitude for this gift, and also to approach the ensuing process with reverence and respect. First thing you'll need to do is position and secure the animal. And so here, if we're thinking about big game hunting, we may be looking at deer, elk, moose, sheep, goat, antelope, and other species. Generally, they don't always come to rest in the most flat and clear and open spaces. A lot of times I've experienced hunting solo and having an elk down on a hillside or mountainside, and this creates a bit of a science project. And so whenever possible, just get the animal rode onto its side and on a flat surface, again, if that's possible. If not, you're probably going to want to break out some 550 cord or other rope that you may have and tie off a leg so that it doesn't end up sliding down the hill or on top of you or other types of situations. So once you've got the animal positioned and secured, then we're going to get into the field dressing requirements. And I think right away it's important to fulfill the various tag obligations that we have depending upon the state or country in which you're hunting. And so you would notch or punch your tag, and then one way or another it may need to be attached to a portion of the animal or the carcass, and that can be done with electrical tape or zip ties, or again whatever's most appropriate in that circumstance. You're going to want to lay out and organize everything that you're going to be using. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just go through my pack and I'll make sure I've got gloves. I always recommend using gloves both in the field and at home. It helps you to keep the meat clean and protects you from various pathogens, and also just makes cleanup quite a bit easier. These are inexpensive and super lightweight, so have multiple pairs. Whatever knives that you're going to be employing, have those available as well, and perhaps even unsheathed again. So anytime your hands get a little messy, you're just not dirtying things up as much. There's a way to be tidy with everything that we do. Whatever your sharpening aid or tool is, have that available as well. And then of course you want to think about the game bags, and I want to mention that very quickly here. Most of the newer game bags are made of various synthetic materials. These are light, breathable, sturdy. Highly recommend. You might also consider some of the kind of old school, more stretchy game bags. These are almost cheesecloth-like, and they're fine. They usually have only a number of uses before they expire. But I will say, when they're stretched very heavily, they're not as protective against flies or egg infiltration on meat in warm conditions, so do be aware of that. Now, there's nothing wrong with using old pillowcases. Sometimes you want to use a section of rope to if you can't get an overhand knot in the end of it, just to tie it off. But those are kind of the things I like to have. And as far as game bags go, let's say I'll usually have 5 or 6 of them for all the various things I'm going to be doing. And I like the smaller bags and have more of them as opposed to one giant bag. Although sometimes a larger bag like this can be nice when you want to just cover up a bunch of your meat or use it for packing, what have you. One thing I don't recommend are these old school canvas bags. They're just too heavy, and they really don't have a place in a modern backcountry hunt. If you're going to use a tarp to lay out meat and other things on, by all means get that spread out. Although a lot of times I will simply place meat directly into bags or lay it on the skinned hide if it's turned skin side up. And you may want a few bags, a few garbage bags. You may want a contractor bag and some of these types of bags. I'll talk about that again in a moment, because they might not get used immediately. And also, if it's evening, which many times it can be when we have success in our hunts. You want to make sure that you've got your headlamp, so everything's ready and you don't have to go rummaging around in your pack for these items. Now, when we get to skinning time, it's very important to assess the situation. Just survey, plan, see how you're going to have to approach this project. And my advice is to just take your time. Keep it safe. We want to start and finish with 10 of these babies. You'll have this choice of, well, am I going to skin this animal how it's presenting itself to me because I can't move it, and that, again, you just work with that. But many times you're going to be looking at, well, do I go from the top down, in other words, along the spine and down, or from the abdomen bottom up? Either way works. It just depends on what, again, your preference is and also what you're going to be doing. If you are planning on caping the animal for taxidermy purposes, there are going to be some specific things that you'll want to know. So for certain species, you'll be wanting to make certain cuts and probably saving the intricate work for after you get the meat processing done, or even significantly later, again, depending on the circumstances. Now, meat management is an interesting topic because generally in the backcountry we're thinking about being efficient and looking at the constraints of weight. So the gutless method of game processing is most commonly used and certainly recommended. What that entails is we're simply not doing the old school or traditional method of opening up the animal on its ventral side and doing a removal of organs and such. We're leaving all that intact, and we're taking the meat off of the carcass because it exists primarily, almost exclusively, on the outside. When we're taking apart any animal, and I don't have a demonstration here, but you can certainly look up other videos, there's probably an order, again, that's going to be presented. But what I like to do is I'll take the quarters off first. So once everything is skinned, I'll remove the shoulder. And the shoulder doesn't have any, on most of these animals, it doesn't have any articulations that we have to deal with like exist in the hind quarter. With just careful cutting, you can remove an entire shoulder, sometimes with some associated rib meat, etc. That's the shoulder. Then we've got the hind quarter, and that needs to be disarticulated at the hip and cut along the pelvis, but you can learn this very quickly. Again, there are any numbers of ways to do it. Just a great place to have a sharp knife and a lot of patience. From there, we can remove what are commonly called the back straps or the paraspinal muscles, which will run along the top of an animal along the spine, and that's sometimes called the top loin in butchery. And that's a very easy piece of meat to remove just by simply working your knife along it and removing it as one large long section. And then we have the inside loins, or the psoas muscles, the fillets. And how one typically would go about that in a gutless approach is to simply work the hand into that area, and I outline the meat and kind of work it free and then cut very carefully with your knife. There's another way I'll talk about in a moment with that. As far as deboning the meat, oh, and I did leave out trim. We always want to take all the trim that we can get. So anywhere that there's trim left on the neck or the ribs, we generally take all of that. In fact, there are some places where you can face substantial fines if you don't get all of it. But once we're done there, we get into this concept of deboning. And again, occasionally, if it's a very short trip, I might leave meat bone in because it's easier to hang meat when it's bone in, and it's also gives us the opportunity for various cuts that are like a bone-in roast or perpendicular shank slices for ossobuco, things like that. One thing though you'll find is if it's hot, even if you're hanging meat, let's say it's bone in, you're going to want to make some longitudinal slices along the bone so that heat can escape, and that's because bone tends to retain the heat very effectively, and rapid cooling is one of our big concerns. As far as the organs go, I will generally take the heart if it hasn't been damaged by the shot. And so what I like to recommend is what's called dropping the guts. So once you're done with everything and you have the carcass there, you can very carefully watch your blade, open up the abdomen and allow the guts to descend a little bit. This will depressurize the carcass and allow you to kind of fish around in there somewhat expediently to retract the heart and then possibly the liver. I'll usually look at those items for some of the cooking that I like to do. The other thing that I was going to mention was when you do drop the guts, that gives you a greater access to those inside loins if you wanted to wait to do it then. That's kind of an optional process. When you get to deboning, it's important again that we've got the meat laid out somewhere. Maybe it's on the carcass itself, or if you have that tarp or one of your game bags open, so it's clean. We want to keep it dirt free. And then you're simply following seams and following along bone to try to take those quarters off essentially in one piece, one continuous piece. And there's an art form to it. Again, there are lots of videos, but if you just take your time and just appreciate the anatomy as you're going along, it's not too difficult. Bagging the meat is something that you want to do pretty rapidly. It's going to cool very effectively in here, and then keeping it clean, always so important. And placing it in the shade whenever possible. And even if you're out in an open country, you could lay meat on the ground and then create a tent over. You don't want to necessarily put something directly over, but if you happen to have a shelter, a tarp, even a jacket that you can use to shelter that meat from the direct sun, that's quite valuable. Then we think about securing our cache, and this is very important, especially if you're in bear country. That could be black bears as well as grizzly bears, brown bears, polar bears, even depending on where you are, of course. And we want to have effective cooling, so that's the first thing. Shade if possible, or create the shade. And then we want airflow. And so if you can get into these natural funnels or creek bottoms and have meat positioned where air can flow over it and cool it quickly, that's going to be more desirable. Water immersion isn't necessarily recommended for the meat. However, if you have meat that's completely cooled, such as overnight, and it's going to take some time for you to extract that meat, you can then put it in a contractor bag, sealed tightly, and submerge the whole thing, maybe cover it with stones, logs, etc. Just make sure that you don't waterlog the meat, and also never put meat in a plastic bag if it's still warm, because that heat will essentially cook itself and it will sour. Okay, visibility of that cache is very important. If you can, move all the meat at least 100 yards away from the carcass or whatever remains from that site. Try to be able to set it up so that you can see it from a distance. And you may want to use flagging like orange tape if you need to make sure that's easy for you to find the location. However, always remove that stuff. I'm always dismayed when I go into the backcountry and I find this flagging that people either forgot or just failed to remove. And so we want to always do that. I like to use an indicator stick. And so if I have meat secured in one way or another, I'll take a stick and maybe put an article of clothing or a piece of that red, orange flagging, whatever, on it, so that if it's disturbed and absent when I return, that'll let me know, oh, something has been messing with this carcass, and I want to be very aware of that. In fact, if you think about being bear aware, here's a good thing that I learned a long time ago. Birds on the ground, bears probably not around. Birds in the air, bear beware. And that can be something you want to think about for sure. And if a bear has claimed the meat, it is hers or his. There are ways to deal with that safely, and always preserve yours and your party's safety in that process. Thoroughly cooling the meat overnight versus heading to the trailhead immediately. Now that might be an option. It's very interesting. Let's say you harvested something in the morning on a hot day, and your thinking is, oh, I'm going to shuttle trips with this warm meat in a pack or bag, and it's going to be confined. That might work optimally if the trip is short. But if the trip might be long, that might actually not be the best thing for the meat. The best thing might be to set up this cache and get the meat completely cooled out overnight, which typically can happen even in early season in the mountains. And then you've got cool meat to pack, which is much easier to deal with. In fact, that's what I would say. We've really seen some great technological advances in packs that are designed to haul meat. And many of the newer packs, this one's Exo Mountain Gear, there's lots of brands. They have these dedicated meat shelves and systems where you can disarticulate the pack and strap the meat, get it in that mid-thoracic region so that the load carries well. Great tools to have. There are some alternatives to packing meat, which, let's say, I mean, obviously there could be motorized options or bikes, e-bikes, there could be livestock, horses, mules, llamas, things like that. But you can also look at the game cart as an option, especially if you happen to be hunting in an area that's either got wide trails or it's roaded with logging roads. Those are going to be give you an option. And probably the single best thing that I've ever used is an old whitewater kayak. I took it in a cigar style boat, I took it, kind of jigsawed, cut open the opening a bit greater, put some straps across it, and it'll slide like butter even on dry ground, but on snow it's amazing. It's very easy to transport meat. So one pack out light, come back with that kayak, haul everything. Works great as long as you don't have to go uphill too much. All right, so I would say, I think I mentioned it before, you don't always only want to put meat in a garbage bag if it's cool. And that's why I had that white bag there as well. You know how black plastic can just heat up so fast if any sun hits it? The white plastic can just be used as a cover. And especially if you're putting meat in your pack, even if it's in the game bag, covering it is nice because then you tend to have less blood and other things getting on your pack and gear. Plan and select the easiest route that you can think of, even if it's a little bit longer. On trail is your best option as far as energy conservation goes, and whenever that's possible for most of your trip, that's a good thing to do. You want to fuel and hydrate before you leave so that you're tanked up, and also have easy access to your water and maybe a snack in your pack as you're getting your load ready, because once you've got that heavy pack on, things can get miserable, even for the well-trained backcountry athlete. This is another great circumstance for trekking poles or even just cutting walking sticks that are really going to help you with these heavy loads, and for not only just for negotiating terrain, but for your safety. Look at pacing. And one of the things I like to do these days is just plan on taking multiple trips. It used to be when I was younger, I'd see if I could carry everything at once and have these massive loads, and that's where the misery and agony oftentimes came into play. Now it's much easier orthopedically just to have some endurance training and make a couple of trips, and that's even true if we're talking double-digit mileage in most cases. So again, you have to make your own choices there, but that's my recommendation. What we want to do also is think about that bear protection again. Whatever you're using for bear protection, whether that be pepper spray, a handgun, or let's say it's your hunting rifle, it needs to be accessible. So if it's just the rifle, you need to be carrying it. If it's strapped on your pack, it's not going to do you any good. And that's especially true if you're packing out meat in brushy country in the dark. It's, again, just one of those safety things we have to remind ourselves never to take a gamble on. Plan for success before you leave on your hunt. So have coolers with ice at the trailhead. And obviously the newer coolers we have available today can keep ice longer, but you can also cover them with insulating blankets and things to get more life out of them so that you still have ice when you come back multiple days later. And that's valuable. Get the meat on the ice and then get it transported to refrigeration as soon as possible. So I know I went very quickly over that, but that's a field process. Now, when we get home, this is exciting. We always want this organized and clean setup, and so you want to have a large, clean workspace of some type, whether that's a plastic table like this that happens to be in a garage. It could be a kitchen island. I've used all those things and more. Workbenches. Doesn't matter. Make sure it's clean. You can even cover it with butcher paper if you need to. Tape it down. And then now you've got a workspace. You're going to have everything available that you're going to need yet again. And so first of all, we need some type of cutting board, whether it's one of these the white ones, one of this style, or a wooden one, that's fine. One of my pro tips would be take a piece of non-slip matting and put underneath it so there's no chance that things can be slipping around when you're working, especially with sharp knives.
Oh yeah, there's bays for sale.
Now, we want to follow a system yet again, so everything needs to be organized. So whenever you're doing your cutting, you're going to place, let's say it's one of these deboned quarters in front of you, and you can kind of, again, you can look these things up, but you can see the separations between the major muscle groups. Oftentimes that equates with roasts, and you want to separate those out first, and then you're going to proceed with how you're going to cut. I like to keep a few knives available right away. I'm quite fond of these semi-flexible angle blade butcher knives. This is very ergonomically effective tool for me to work with, but I also will utilize kind of a more traditional boning style knife that gets most of the work done. And then when you're cutting steaks or through large thicker areas, you want some type of a breaking knife, which would just be a larger bladed knife. And I'll always keep these usually quite sharp, and they're ready to go before I begin, but I'll also have a steel of some type available. And one of the tricks with a steel is you want to touch up your blade before you notice it becoming significantly dull. So you have some system of either number of minutes or per section. Oh, okay, I'll stop and I'll just touch up my knife briefly, and that'll extend its cutting life quite significantly. One of the things I'd like to mention is as you're working on making these major cuts, just be fastidious with trimming. We want to trim away any game fat in most cases, unless you're talking about bears, because that game fat is not as flavorful as we'll see on some domestic animals. Sometimes it has a very off-putting taste. Fascia, what's called silver skin, anything that looks like gristle, bloodshot meat, all that, clean that all off. That goes in your garbage pail. And then as you're finding these pieces of trim, just go ahead and process those right away. So I'll usually just cube my trim and throw it in. Oftentimes it's a stainless steel bowl, or sometimes I have some of the food safe poly containers. Throw them right in there. That's the stew meat. It's ready to go. It can be wrapped and frozen later. If it's going to be stir fry, I might just cut it a bit differently. Again, a little bit longer strips for the stir fry. Either way, it's good to go. And if I decide I want to have it as grind for burger, I'll go ahead and freeze it, and I can come back to that at another time to do a definitive grind. Partially frozen meat works better for that, and also for sausage making and things like that, if that's going to happen. But that's kind of how you're processing along. So the trim is always just building up. And what I'll do with the trim, if I'm going to freeze it for short term, and let's just say it's a couple of weeks, I'll probably just throw it all in a freezer bag once I've got enough accumulated, and just put it right in the freezer. If I think it's going to need to be stored longer, I'll do a more elaborate wrapping process. Now, the major cuts that we take, let's say off the shoulder, you're going to get an arm roast on the underside of the shoulder blade or scapula beneath the spine. That's where the infraspinatus muscle lies, but that's where we get our flat iron steaks. That's a great cut to take from a shoulder. And then above that, we sometimes call that the mock tender. And other than that, I'll generally end up creating trim out of most of my shoulder meat. Same thing with the neck, although sometimes I will keep a neck roast if I extract that. And then with the hind quarter, those are where your major roasts are going to come from. So you're going to see the top and bottom round, the sirloin roast, sirloin tip, and the eye of round. And those 5 things will come out very clearly when you follow the process we're talking about here. And then with those, I might decide to keep them as roasts. I might cut steaks. I usually do that with the sirloin roast. And if I'm going to make jerky, I will again probably use the rounds to do that. And if you want really long strips, which are a little bit more chewy, you can cut with the grain. But if you cut across grain, your jerky is going to be more tender. Just some basic ideas there. Those top loins or the back straps, what I will usually do is I'll just section those into 3 sections, and I'll label those front, middle, and rear portions. Then later, if I want to cut them into chops, I can prior to cooking, or I can cook them whole as well. Same kind of thing is true with the tenderloins. If they're not eaten fresh, which is usually the tradition to do, I'll freeze them whole, and then I can cut them into medallions later if I want. Some people like to take their chops and slice them almost all the way through and open them up, or butterfly them. Again, that's an option depending on the thickness that you like to utilize. And what I'm going to say is, when you get all of this done, usually what I'll do is I'll just try to keep my workspace clean. So if I'm doing a shoulder, I'll do all the work there with the shoulder, and then I'll go ahead and wrap and freeze it, and then I'll take the next one out of refrigeration and do that. So again, it's very systematic. How you wrap is up to you. Now, butcher paper is really the traditional method, and it can be used by itself. It's got a coating on it, and that's how it's designed to use. And there's a couple different tricks for wrapping and folding that you'll learn over time, so that you make these nice little Christmas presents, as opposed to when I first got started, they were fairly crude. The other thing that you want to have as an option is using the plastic wrap. And so the plastic wrap, you can get these big industrial rolls. I actually like to fully wrap in plastic wrap before I go into the butcher paper. And believe it or not, that you can get a really airtight seal, and meat can last for years in the freezer if it comes to that, although I find that most of the meat I have only lasts 6 to 9 months. Make sure you always use the freezer tape, though. It's got a better adhesive than, let's say, masking tape, and it makes the process better. You can also take the plastic wrapped meat and put it in a freezer bag. Again, you have to be a little careful to get the air out of it, but it can work. And then if you have a vacuum sealer, that's great. These can be fast and efficient, and also they can keep meat for a very long time. So I tend to use a mix of these things depending on what works best for what I'm doing. When I am making sausage, whether that's bulk or link, or I've got these stew meat packages, I'll oftentimes vacuum seal them because I can get a great conformation around the package. But then with the larger roasted steaks, I find that the traditional method works just fine for me. Again, choices are up to you. When we finally get to preparation and nutrition, one of the things that I would say is leanness can lead to dryness. So all this game meat is extremely lean, again, in most cases, with just a few exceptions. And it tends to behave a certain way in the kitchen. And so I would just say very briefly, cook your tender cuts, and those would be your chops and your fillets, and even some of those sirloin steaks. Cook those fast, hot, medium rare at best, and you're going to get a great flavor that you're going to love. If you tend to cook game meat too long, it becomes what's known as liver flavored leather, and that's where probably a lot of people have had poor experiences, as opposed to it being the delicacy that it really is. Now, with your tougher cuts, and those might be your shoulder roasts or your shanks, and I failed to mention that when I'm working on deboning those quarters, I'll go ahead and make sure I take all that shank meat off as well in a deboning situation. So I've got, again, all trim. But when I'm cooking that kind of meat, you want to go low and slow and get it to well done. So that could be a crock pot or other types of techniques. Rubs and marinades can come into play. For whatever reason, with game, I tend to go more with rubs than with marinades, but I've tried them all, and they all can be good. You can use one of the tenderizing tools, like a jacquard with the knives, as well as like a meat hammer, or even devices that kind of make Swiss steak. Anything that you find works for your cooking style and your favorite meals that you like to share with your family and friends. Another thing for backpackers to think about is this game meat makes outstanding jerky. And you can take those strips of meat that you've cut for jerky, they will go in a marinade or a brine, and that's generally got to have some type of acid, some salt. There's some different theories on whether we need to use other preservatives or not, but once you've got the jerky marinated and flavored, it can be dehydrated, it can be smoked, you can do that in the oven. There's lots of ways you can make jerky, and then with jerky I do like to vacuum seal it and keep it in the freezer. When you take it out, it lasts a very long time. It's always fresh and delicious. Game meat, as you probably know, is very high in protein. In fact, it's among the highest in proteins because of its just density, absence of fat and marbling, and then also generally coming from these wild and healthy animals. We're seeing as much as 9 grams of protein per ounce, which is exceptionally high. Very also high in iron, B12, zinc, and selenium, among other things. So it's a great addition to any lifetime athlete or backcountry athlete's diet. There are pathogen considerations, though, I think, with any meat and meat handling, and we always want to have this whole, cleanliness and rapid cooling and all those things, but also we want to be aware that there can be other issues to be dealt with. If we freeze meat for anywhere from, let's say, 20 to 45 days, it kills the bacteria within the meat and also many, but not all, parasites. That's a good practice to have with your game meat. And we also need to cook certain cuts. Let's say if it's a wild boar or if it's a bear, the presence of trichinosis, among other things. We may want to have that, not may, we absolutely want to have it to a minimum of 160, possibly 180 degrees to make sure that we, again, have eradicated any toxicity there. And also there's agency testing available for all of our game meats these days. You can, many times it costs you nothing, and you can go to your local Fish, Wildlife, Parks, Game and Fish Department, whatever it's called, and they will do a test of a sample of meat and let you know what's going on there. And my advice would be to always use all these practices we're talking about, but also feel free to not consume something that you think is marginal. It's just not necessary to do. So in finishing up, I would call this whole thing a field to table journey. Some call it the field to fork. It's a primal and gratifying experience, and there's a lot of work involved, but it's a labor of love indeed.